Hello friends, today we'll be discussing Ukraine crisis. The central question would be, will Russia invade Ukraine? How is this crisis going to unfold? Let us apply certain concepts of game theory as well as geopolitics to this geopolitical game. We know that there are players, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, US and so on. All these players have their own interests. We need to see how these interests of various players interact. What kind of equation or equilibrium does it give rise to? Can the incentives of these players be altered? Can the equilibrium be changed? We would want to change this equilibrium so that conflict is resolved peacefully and there is no war. How will this crisis unfold in the near future? What do we expect? So let us look at the players first. We have Putin, who is an aggressive player in this game. Second is NATO, which is provoking Putin by its actions. And third is Ukraine. Ukraine here is not only a player but also the playground, because the crisis is unfolding in eastern Ukraine. So let us now see the concerns or interests of each player. The first player here is Russia. Russia has certain concerns. Russia believes that NATO is expanding eastward. So the United States theory of encirclement, which is a manifestation of Cold War mentality, is still being reflected in the actions of NATO. So if this is Russia, United States through NATO is placing interceptors, radars. So the overall system is called missile defense system. So this missile shield is being deployed closer and closer to the Russian borders. Why is Russia worried? It is because there was an understanding during the Cold War or later years of Cold War that is called the START Treaty. So there was a balance between the weapon systems of US and Russia, or USSR for that matter. Now, if US is successful in deploying all this missile defense system around Russia, the missiles originating out of Russia can be shot down immediately. Now, Russia believes that this would tilt balance in favor of US. Russia does not have such shield around US. So US missiles would easily be reaching Russia, whereas Russian missiles would not be able to take off from Russia, because the moment they take off, they'll be shot down. They'll be tracked and shot down. So Russia is wary of this missile shield deployment in Eastern Europe by NATO, but the agenda remains US agenda. Now the third concern Russia has is regarding market for Russian gas. Russia has nearly 13% of world's oil and 40% of natural gas, world's natural gas. Most of this is sold in European markets. It is transported through various pipelines through Ukraine majorly. Now, this crisis and the subsequent sanctions which will kick in, this may result into the market loss for Russian gas and Russian oil. Now, this is a major concern which may have impact on Russian economy. Now, the next interest that Russia has is seeking more power. We have already discussed it is Cold War mentality. So the concept, geopolitical concept of sphere of influence is applicable here. You must also know about the concept of Lebensraum. This was a concept which was given by Ratzel, and this concept was followed by Hitler in expanding his territory in World War II. Now, what does Lebensraum mean? Lebensraum means that the state is like an organism. So the way a human baby continues to grow and becomes an adult human being, the body size increases, the nutritional requirement increases. Similarly, this concept given by Ratzel, Lebensraum says that the state is an organism. So with due course of time, the state would need to expand. To fulfill its demand for resources, the state would need more and more territory. So this is a very aggressive concept, right? That is why we associate the same with Hitler, and Ratzel was a German. So seeking more power is definitely the motive of Russia. Putin wants to enlarge his sphere of influence. This is a major factor which is reflected in the actions of NATO. Losses matter more. Now, next interest, if you see this losses matter more is a understanding that we gain from the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amor Tversky, who worked on behavioral economics, so human psychology. So they say that humans humans give more value to what they hold in hand. So we are more worried about losses than gains. So Crimea is presently under the operational control of Russia. Point is, Russian action will have this as a central theme, that it doesn't want to jeopardize its hold over Crimea. No matter what Putin does, Putin would never want to let go of Crimea, because Crimean Peninsula is central to Russian strategy. It is present on Black Sea. There, Putin has the Black Sea fleet of Russia. So, strategically, resource-wise, it's very important for Russia. So, Russia will not make any move which will jeopardize its control over Crimea. Now, first mover advantage. In this game, geopolitical game, Russia has two options: escalate or de-escalate. And we believe that the first mover would be Russia, because Russia has the capability to act quick, act fast, and reverse the gains of other parties or increase its own gains. Let us now understand the stand of NATO. Now, NATO is following an open door policy. NATO is a security organization which is being driven by US agenda. Now, what is this US agenda? Think about Russia, or you think about China. What is happening? US agenda is encirclement. Now, this encirclement in Russia is through NATO, whereas in China it is through Quad, or even the concept of Indo-Pacific, right? The concept of Indo-Pacific. So US is following same type of agenda in both spheres. Now, NATO believes that it is in the interest of NATO as well as US to get closer and closer to Russian borders, so that they can deploy effectively the missile defense shields. Here, Ukraine, the central problem here is Ukraine is seeking the membership of NATO, and this is what Russia doesn't like. So NATO here is saying that we have an open door policy, so it refuses to give in to the demand of Russia that it would not consider the membership of Ukraine in NATO. So open door policy for members. Second, NATO is worried about the security and territorial integrity of its members, because Russia is seen as an aggressor, and this has been proved because of the record of Russia in Georgia, in the breakaway regions or separatist regions in Caucasus, like you have South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and so on, and then territorial integrity. So even Ukraine is worried about its own security and territorial integrity. So NATO knows that Russia is also expanding, seeking to increase its sphere, and it is going to be aggressive on its neighbors. Next, missile defense system. So this is completely a USA agenda which NATO is implementing. Next, threat perception in Eastern Europe about Russian plans. So not only NATO or US, but the countries in Eastern Europe, they are also worried about Russian intentions, because Russia is seen as a behemoth or hegemon who is moving and expanding the similar way where in Southeast Asia or South Asia we see the threat of China among all its neighbors. So this is regarding the concerns of NATO. Next is the drivers of Ukraine. Now, the first and foremost fear is of Russian aggression. No matter what happens in this conflict, if there is a conflict, the biggest loser is going to be Ukraine, because the conflict is going to be fought on its own soil. It's a great loss for any country to be in war. So the fear of Russian aggression is prominent. What is Ukraine trying to do? Ukraine is trying to hedge its own interests by joining NATO. So it wants to protect its territory. It wants to protect its sovereignty. It knows that Russia doesn't respect any of these two. So by joining NATO, it secures this too against Russia. protect territorial integrity, because it has a clear recent experience of Crimea, that Russia simply moved in troops. Now, as we are speaking, even in the Donbas region, Donetsk region, Russia has recognized legally this as nationalities. So these are separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. So this is clear intention of Russia that it does not respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and this is the biggest concern Ukraine has. Now, prevent internal and external threats. So here, the way Chanakya in his Arthashastra had said that a country can face threat by a combination of external and internal factors. So it can be an external threat which is abated internally. So here we have the threat of Russia, which is magnified in eastern Ukraine through these two regions by the presence of Russians who act as separatists. So here, this is the biggest concern, one big concern that Ukraine has. And lastly, sovereignty in decision making. Now, this decision making can be economic, can be political, and so on. But here, the problem is Russia tends to dominate and does not want Ukraine to have this sovereignty, because any action of Ukraine which is not perceived by Russia in Russian interest will not be allowed to be implemented. So Russia will try to protect its own interest by trying to influence the policies that are made in Kyiv, that is the capital of Ukraine. So similarly, red lines are drawn, like China. You speak about Taiwan or Hong Kong, China would not allow these countries to do anything which it perceives that it is not in Chinese interest. Similarly, if you look at India, India maintains that all its neighbors should behave in such a manner that they should not cross a red line, right? So presence of Chinese military and so on is not acceptable to Indians. You go to America, America still follows Monroe Doctrine, right? Monroe Doctrine. So it considers the entire continent of North and South America its own domain and does not allow any other country to influence the policies there. So all big players have this. So here, Ukraine is worried about sovereignty in decision making. So you can see the picture here. These are the regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, separatist areas. And here, Russia has recognized these as nations today, right? So legal nations. So this is like a provocation to the West. And this is the battleground that we are seeing. But Russia can definitely enter in from different areas. Russian troops have already started moving in this area. And this is the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. Now let us see how is this game going to play out. Now the first question is, who is going to act first? NATO will not act first. Why? Because NATO has a reputation. It is an organization. It's European and American powers. They will want to keep their image clean in front of the world, not be seen as aggressor. Rather, they would want themselves to be seen as protectors of democracy, upholders of rights. So NATO is not going to act first. Will Ukraine act first? No, Ukraine in this crisis will not act first. Why? Because it is going to lose either way. No matter whether you win or lose in a war, people suffer. So, and it is Ukrainian people which are going to suffer the most. So Ukraine will not act first. So the first action will be Russia, right? Russia will be the first actor. And rightfully, yesterday, Russia moved in its troops in the eastern Ukrainian separatist regions dominated by Russians. So we go in the reverse way. In game theory, Russia will act first, but then Russian actions will be determined by Russian perceptions regarding the strategies of Ukraine and NATO. So let us start with NATO. If we look at NATO's choices, NATO has two choices. One, to promote peace, or NATO can provoke Russia. So promote peace. Peace means what? That NATO gives up on missile defense, does not give membership to Ukraine, and does not move east, right? But then you are very well aware that these are the three things that NATO would never do. NATO is clearly rejecting this demand of membership. It says we have an open door policy. So in short term, okay, fine, we are not going to give membership to Ukraine, but in long term, will not permanently close this door. We want to keep it open. Missile defense, it's an US agenda, so they are not going to give up on that, because US is driving aggressively this agenda and telling Russia that these missile defense and these interceptors and radars are meant for Iran. So they are diverting. They are saying it is meant for Iran, not for you. So they are not going to give it up. And NATO will move east because it is geopolitics, sphere of influence. It works. It helps them control Russia, control China, and also the Middle East. So the dominant strategy of NATO is not to make peace. It provokes Russia by doing exactly these things. So deploying missile defense in long term, giving membership maybe to Ukraine, and moving eastward and expanding its sphere of influence. So we see that this is the strategy, dominant strategy that NATO may follow, if not today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, or in near future. And Russia knows this very well. Next, let us see what are the options of Ukraine. Ukraine has two options. Again, peace and provocation. So what is peace? Ukraine simply accepts Russian demands, doesn't join NATO, then takes or compromises its sovereignty, compromises sovereignty on gas pricing, on membership of NATO, on other policies where Russians have interest. So Russia as a country and Russians as people present in eastern part of the country, Ukraine. Now, you understand that Ukraine will never do this completely. Why? Because the moment Ukraine accepts Russian demands, gives up membership of NATO, or gives up means doesn't seek the membership of NATO, and makes its own policies align with Russian policies, it goes against the territorial integrity and sovereignty, right? Sovereignty of Ukraine. So it knows that Russia will make peace today. So if Ukraine goes peacefully, Russia will make peace today, but tomorrow, day after tomorrow, Russia is going to come in. So Ukraine knows that no matter what it does, in due course of time, Russia, I mean, it's like you accept 10% demands, but tomorrow Russia is going to demand more. So it knows that it's a spiral. Unless Russia gains significant control over Ukraine as a territory or as a country or as a polity, even society. So Ukraine is not going to go for peace. Provocation is in the interest of Ukraine. Why? Because by joining NATO, it can secure its territory as well as its sovereignty. By joining NATO, it can maintain its sovereignty as well as territorial integrity. And by joining NATO, it can be ensured about peace. Now, how much? It's a question mark, but at least by joining NATO, it knows that Russia will not dare directly to act, because it's not Ukraine versus Russia then. If Ukraine moves closer to NATO, as is seen now, it's a conflict between US or NATO and Russia, not Ukraine per se. So we see through these equations that the dominant strategy of Ukraine, if not today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, is going to provoke Russia. Because the moment Ukraine settles for peace, it knows that Russian demands will just go on snowballing and it's going to lose in the long term. So now we come to the actions of Russia. What are the dominant choices Russia has? Again, Russia has two: make peace and provoke Ukraine as well as West, including Europe, and that is NATO and United States of America. Now Russia making peace means what? Demilitarize, respect the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Ukraine, allow the missile defense systems to be deployed close to its borders, and be non-aggressive, right? Now the point is, why would Russia do this? Because it knows it has nothing to lose. Russia already has operational control of Crimea. Why would it demilitarize now? Why would it allow Ukraine to join NATO? Why would it allow missile defense? It goes against Russian national interest. Putin as a person, if we understand, he's not going to bow down. Main nahi jhukega, right? Yeah, main jhukega nahi. That's how Pushpa says this. And Putin, I told you, he says Pushka. It's a Russian word for fire. So in Indian languages, Pushpa means flower. In Russian, Pushka means fire. So he doesn't have to say this also, right? He is fire. So he's not going to bow down. And when we speak about provocation, it works for Russia because its sphere of influence increases. Territorial gain is permanent, right? Even if sanctions kick in, territory remains with Russia. Next, it emerges as a dominant player. and it can dictate terms and conditions to the West. Plus, Russian economy, Russia has made its economy such that sanctions will not hurt it much, though it will, but it will still survive. So Russian survival and its expansion, increasing sphere of influence, that provocation is in Russian interest, and Russia knows that even if Russia makes peace today, is NATO and US, are they going to give away their agenda of implementing missile defense or moving east or giving membership to Ukraine and surrounding countries? No. So if NATO is not going to give up on this, why would Russia give up on its own interest? So it's a clear equation between the two. Next, we have put this as a game here. I've displayed this as game here. Very interesting. Just look at it. Russia has two options: be hostile, be peaceful. NATO and Ukraine together, they have two options: be hostile, be peaceful. Now, think about it. That when Russia decides what it has, because Russia is the first mover, when Russia decides what it should do, Russia can be hostile, but Russian actions would be determined by its perceptions regarding the actions of NATO and Ukraine. I repeat again, Russia has two choices, but Russian choices would be dictated by what Russia thinks would NATO and Ukraine do, no matter what Russia chooses now. So think about it. Russia can be hostile. Now, NATO or Ukraine has two choices: hostile or peaceful. If Russia is hostile and NATO is also hostile, there is a conflict. So both these numbers reflect the value that these countries attach to the outcome. So this is just indicator, right? So if Russia is hostile, NATO, Ukraine is hostile, they get 4-4. But if Russia is hostile and NATO, Ukraine is peaceful, you see the change. Russia gains 8 points because obviously it will gain territory, sphere of influence, and NATO and Ukraine will back down. They are going to lose. So only 2. If Russia demilitarizes, right, makes peace. But if Ukraine and NATO are hostile, think about it, they gain because they can implement this missile defense. Ukraine gets the membership of NATO, Russia demilitarizes, so Russia loses big, but they gain big, NATO and Ukraine. As opposed to it, if both parties make peace, everybody wins. So this is win-win. This is win-win. Both parties win. It is good for all, for NATO, Ukraine as well as Russia. So NATO and Ukraine should give up their demands, compromise on this solution. Russia should also give up its aggressive demands, make a compromise, make peace with each other, draw red lines, agree to something diplomatically, and then it's a win-win situation for all. But now you understand, I mean, it's simple, clear enough that 7-7 is better than 4-4. But the problem is, this is classic prisoner's dilemma game, where even if this outcome is better than this, this is what will majorly happen, not this. Why? Think about it. Now, again, going back, Russia has two choices, hostile or peace. But when Russia makes its choices, it will compare these red numbers. Think about it. Russia will say that if I am hostile and if NATO Ukraine is hostile, I get only 4, right? But if I am hostile and NATO Ukraine makes, I mean, if I make peace and NATO Ukraine is hostile, I get only 2. So comparing this 4 and this 2, what will Russia choose? Russia will choose this 4. Similarly, Russia will say that no matter what I do, if NATO Ukraine is making peace, it will compare its outcomes here. So still 8 is better. So when Russia makes its choice, it is very clear by comparing these 2 boxes and these 2 boxes that it makes sense for Russia to be hostile. Russia says that 7 is fine than 4. But the problem is Russia is not sure. Russia says that if I make peace in the hope that even Ukraine and NATO will make peace so that all win, what is the guarantee that they will not move from 7 to 8? Because NATO Ukraine will compare these blue numbers, 4 and 2, 8 and 7. So 8 is better than 7. if Russia makes peace and these people are hostile, what happens? Russia loses big. Russia doesn't want to take this chance. So Russia understands that it makes sense for it to be hostile no matter what NATO Ukraine does. This is called the dominant strategy of Russia. Similarly, NATO and Ukraine will also make this choice. They'll compare these blue numbers. So 4 and 2. So 4 is better than 2 being hostile, and 8 is better than 7 again being hostile. So this clearly shows that the dominant strategy of both players is to be hostile. The cause for this is trust. They lack trust. So both understand, both realize that 7-7 is better. But both of them know that even if they make 7, they hope that the other party is here. But the problem is the other party can shift to hostile stand and make them lose big. So this fear about the intentions of the other party is at the root of this prisoner's dilemma game. This is called the trust issue. They do not trust each other. NATO and Ukraine have a clear-cut picture of Russian intentions, which they know very well what Putin stands for. And Putin exactly has the same kind of mentality towards United States and NATO. They know each other's records very well. So rather than this win-win, they're going to land up in this hostile. And this is very difficult to break because this is prisoner's dilemma. Now friends, once we have seen this game theory application to Ukraine crisis, let us see what are the factors which can help us diffuse the situation and make the situation more peaceful and win-win for both parties. Now, in such a typical prisoner's dilemma game, credible communication is the most important thing, or credible authority. So here, we need an external authority that makes them behave, which is very difficult considering that these two players are sovereigns. So think about it. In India, we have, I'll just give you an example. In India, we have states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka who are fighting over the waters of Kaveri. Now, if you leave the Kaveri issue in the hands of the politicians or decision makers in these two states, what are they going to do? Tamil Nadu or Karnataka is not going to release complete water unless its own needs are fulfilled. Tamil Nadu would demand its share irrespective of whether Karnataka gets water or not. So Tamil Nadu will try to protect, or the decision makers of Tamil Nadu will try to protect their own turf. Whereas the incentive for Karnataka politicians is to hold on to as much water as possible to ensure that their wood banks, their farmers, their industries are protected. Now in such case, again, the way these two states would react may be there in their own self-interest. Now that's the crux. It is in their own self-interest, but it goes against the interest of the country, that is India. So what do we need? We need the central government to make law or regulate the way waters are divided between different interstate rivers. So here constitution makers brought in Article 262. So this is clearly an example how an external authority or a higher superior authority can implement or such a solution and make this rational self-interested players to play the win-win game. Otherwise it's going to be win-lose. So here also, when we speak about the Ukraine crisis, because these are all sovereign countries, right? We don't have external authorities, but what we have is United Nations or the Security Council. But then we know here that the Russia or US through NATO, these are the same players who are in the crisis. So when you have a player and a referee from the same team, you know what you get. You do not get a fair play. So here the probability of external authority making them behave is minimal. Next, what if all the players give credible commitment? It can solve the problem that they set up the rules of the game more fairly. But is it feasible? Just look at it. For NATO, it would mean what? It would mean to ban the entry of Ukraine into NATO indefinitely and give up missile defense program in Eastern Europe. So this NATO, cannot do or may not do. Ukraine, it means to declare that it will never seek NATO entry as well as be mindful of Russia's interest. Now this would be like giving up its own sovereignty and autonomy, so or even territorial integrity. So Ukraine may never do this. And if you think about Russia, it would mean that Russia should respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine and sovereignty of Ukraine. But then as we are speaking about this, we know that Russia has already entered Donbas region of Ukraine in eastern part of the country, right? And it has formally legally recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk. So this is also not feasible. So credible commitment from these players is not going to come forward, and even if it comes, the opposing parties will not trust each other's commitment. I said, look at how the crisis is unfolding. Russia has formally recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk as People's Republic. Now, these were the areas which had declared their independence after Russia took Crimea. But Russia itself had not legally recognized these areas. Now, yesterday, Russia recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as People's Republic in Donbas region. Now, this is just the beginning of the crisis. It clearly shows the intentions of Russia. And this is very clear that Russia is not going to give up on this crisis. They're not going to back down. Now, in such a condition, what condition? Prisoner's dilemma. In such a condition, when the parties are locked like this, they can either maintain peace or rush into a showdown. Because once the crisis begins, they have no incentive to back down. We have seen in the game that we saw on the last page that the hostile, right? This equilibrium they are locked up in. They are not going to make peace, right? The reason is backing down has a huge cost, because you don't trust the other party to back down once you have backed down. So just imagine a situation. There are two persons, this person and this person, who have guns in their hand, and they are pointing these guns at each other. Now the point is, how can you diffuse this situation? When both of them put down the gun at the same time, right? Or both of them shoot at each other. It's that simple. Anyone who backs down individually is going to get shot by the other player, because they know exactly, this person exactly knows that this person wants to kill it. This person exactly knows that what this person wants is to kill self. So here the problem is, either they maintain peace or they rush into a showdown. Other factor can be time, that they become so tired, weary. So just remember Operation Parakram. So Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when he was Prime Minister, he had brought all the forces to the border of Rajasthan, right, with Pakistan. So on the Pak border, Indo-Pak border. But then the forces remained there for 1 year nearly. There was a lot of attrition, and then the situation changed, and then both the countries withdrew. But here in this case, it was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. We are now speaking about Pushka, fire, Putin. There is great difference between the mentality of Putin and Atal Bihari Vajpayee, right? Putin is fire, so he's not going to back down. So will Russia act? Finally, what can we say? Russia has already gained Crimea. He knows the capability of Ukraine. Ukraine can give a tough fight, but Russia knows that if it acts first, it can easily inflict damage on Ukraine and gain territory. Who is the target? The real target is United States of America and Western countries, NATO. Why is this target? Because it's a clear message. Russia, as seen in this picture, is sending a clear message to the West that don't mess with me. We are not going to back down. We are not going to give up. They are going to protect their sphere of influence and going to establish dominance in their sphere of influence. Russia can inflict damage and win. Economy is not very great, but it can hold itself in sanctions. So Putin in so many years has taken care to proof the economy completely against, if not completely, at least partially against the sanctions. So oil exports will hurt, but Russian economy will not be completely brought down to its knees. And then Putin is practical. I told you, Putin is extremely practical person. So he exactly knows that sanctions are temporary, but the territorial gain that it has, for example, it got Crimea, now it is into Donbas. Territorial gains are permanent. Think about it. We have Aksai-Chin in the northern portion, which is a contested territory between India and China. It's an Indian territory which is illegally occupied by China. But then Aksai-Chin remains with China, right? Think about POK. The whole world knows it is Pak-occupied, illegally occupied Kashmir. 1948. Today we are in 2022. But it still remains in the operational control of Pakistan. Once you get a territory, it's extremely difficult to dislodge, right? So sanctions are temporary, territorial gain is permanent. Lastly, by yesterday's announcement of legal recognition to Donetsk and Luhansk in Donbas, What is Putin trying to do? His strategy seems to be to push West against the wall. He's just testing in gradual steps, incrementing the actions to push West against the wall. He's checking how the West reacts, right? And he's clearly making his intentions crystal clear in front of the West that they have to back down. He's not going to. So he's not going to blink because it's Putin's personality. मैं झुकेगा नहीं. His fire. Think about it. That Putin has been ruling Russia since long. He knows that he's getting older now. Now he doesn't want to be remembered as another Gorbachev. You know that the breakdown of USSR, the disintegration of USSR, locally, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the ruler at that time, he is considered responsible for the disintegration. His policies are considered responsible for disintegration of USSR. Russia today is ruled by Putin, and Putin does not want to go down in history as another Gorbachev. He wants to make his point that he is strong, he is going to dominate, and he is not going to back down against the West. He is an Iron Man. That clearly tells us that what to expect. My understanding clear that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. But in this scenario, who has the last laugh? It is Xi Jinping. Because once the world gets involved in another conflict of this scale, everyone's going to suffer. And in this, who gains most is China and their philosophy of Tianxia. So in long term, China has this vision of the middle kingdom. The whole world is the kingdom. And what is the seat of this kingdom? It is China. So on one hand, India says, Vasundhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is a family. It's a harmonious concept. On the other hand, China has this Tianxia, a whole world as a kingdom ruled by China. China will have last laugh because presently it is also an aggressor against its neighbors. But the decision of Russia getting into conflict with US diverts the global attention against Chinese actions. Plus, if Putin comes out strong, then China also can justify its actions against its neighbors. So, ultimately, we need to analyze the impact of all this on the interests of India, which we'll do soon in our discussion that we are going to have in Decipher today 6:30 p.m. Be there. Subscribe to this channel, like, share and comment on this video. Thank you.